In this section, we're going to look at the actual drafting of the Constitution. Now, a number of events had led up to the Constitutional Convention. There had been an economic depression that occurred after the Revolutionary War. The extent the social democratization of society which had occurred during and after the Revolution is hard really to understand or express. Although a historian by training as well as a political scientist, I didn't really understand how the impact of the Revolution had had an effect on the social structure of the United States until in 2001, my wife and I went to northern New York to do a bike ride across the northern part of the state of New York along the Erie Canal. Preliminary to that, we had gone over to Canada, into the province of Ontario. And there we discovered that there were communities that traced their origin to the period following the Revolutionary War, where entire groups of people who had been loyal to the Crown picked up and moved to Ontario so they would continue to be loyal to the Crown. Now, there was also a certain amount of political turmoil, and that is best typified by Shays's Rebellion. We really don't have time to discuss Shays's Rebellion in great detail. There's a very good article on it in Wikipedia. What happened was the mercantile class that controlled the legislature of Massachusetts had passed and imposed a number of taxes which fell largely on the landowners, particularly the small farmers of western Massachusetts. Many of those landowners had gotten their land as a result of their service in the Revolutionary War, and those taxes threatened to take their land from them, and led by Captain Daniel Shays, they mounted a rebellion. Now, if you're interested in the details of that, you can go ahead and look them up. But it convinced the nationalists that something had to be done. When Massachusetts turned to the Congress of the Confederation for assistance, they were told, "We don't have any authority to help you on that. We don't have any money. We don't have any troops. Have a nice day." There had been several meetings before the Constitutional Convention occurred, one in Alexandria, one in Annapolis, each of which were trying to figure out how to deal with the trade problems between the states, but had gotten virtually nowhere. At the Annapolis Convention, a young attorney from New York by the name of Alexander Hamilton suggested that a new Constitution be drafted to replace the Articles of Confederation. And so they called upon the Congress of the Confederation to ask the states to nominate delegates to send them to Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. Now, there is an absolutely excellent book on the drafting of the Constitution. It's called A Meeting in Philadelphia. I don't think written by Catherine Drinker Bowen. It's called Miracle in Philadelphia. Mostly the delegates were well-to-do, well-educated, and politically active. Another thing that united them is they were all basically nationalists. They believed in a stronger national government. Plans for the Constitutional Convention were numerous, but the two that we mostly study are the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Large State Plan, which is what the Virginia Plan is frequently called for a bicameral legislature based on population, a national executive selected by Congress, the details of which were kept quite fluid, and a national judiciary. The primary difference between it and the Small State Plan was twofold. The Small State Plan called for a unicameral legislature where each state would have one representative, and a plural legislature with each head of each department, as had been the case with the Articles of Confederation, chosen by Congress. Both were pretty sketchy with regard to what would be done with the national judiciary. Well, the convention had to compromise. The four compromises that we primarily focus on are the Three-Fifths Compromise, which dealt with the status of slaves. The southern states wanted to count the slaves as people for purposes of representation, but that and that alone. The northern states did not wish to count them for purposes of representation because it would have inflated the amount of power for the southern states rather substantially. In a couple of the states, like South Carolina, almost 40% of the population was slave. The Commerce Clause Compromise was designed to work out the differences between the northern and southern views on commerce. The South insisted on a slave trade moratorium, that is to say, no laws which would impinge upon the slave trade for at least 20 years, and a ban on export taxes, because the South largely lived on exports. The question of how many chambers to have and how they would be organized was settled by the Great Compromise, in which each state received equality in the Senate, electing 2 senators, but the House of Representatives would be chosen on the basis of population. Now, they really punted on the issue of the election of the president. When we get to the presidency, we'll discuss the various options that were presented. Ultimately, they decided to create an electoral college which would perform the duty. Now, there's a side story that's sort of interesting. At one point, the delegates were almost to the point of breaking up and going home when Benjamin Franklin, who was the oldest of the candidates, oldest of the delegates, stood up and said, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, we must hang together, or we shall surely hang separately."